Okay. Well, hopefully you've got the paperwork that was on your chairs for you. Last week we started into a new series called Homecoming and the Heart of the Gospel. And basically the first 3 pages are identical to last week, but on the back page, thanks Shane, on the back page the questions and the content that we're going to be kind of going through are going to be a little bit different. So I just want to make we're still kind of, I suppose, trying to get wisdom on how to do this as kind of the restrictions lift and things change all around us. We're still find ourselves in a position of not being able to provide Bibles for the chairs on a Sunday. So we're printing these for now, and we ask that you just take them home, put them in the middle of your Bible, put them on your bedside locker or on a magnet with your, on your fridge or whatever. But we'd really, really love it. Instead of just, I suppose, looking at the content as we're together on Sundays, but you really, really commit to sticking with this Luke 15 passage that we are exploring or have been exploring. And we're going to be taking a deeper look at it again this morning. So I'm going to read for us. I'm going to read the same text again. Hopefully that's not too taxing for us. But the parable of the lost son. So that's on the inside, right-hand side page, starting at verse 11. And I'm going to read all the way through to the end again, to verse 32. So Lord, we pray that as we read this, that as we spend time with it again, that you open our eyes and you give us wisdom and you teach us from your word and you inspire us as we ask questions about how we can live in light of everything that you're doing and everything you're saying here. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, "I want my share of your estate now before you die." So this father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all of his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all of his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, "At home, even the hired servants have enough food to spare, and here I am, dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant.' So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, filled with loving compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you. I'm no longer worthy of being called your son.' But his father said to the servants, 'Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf that we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead and is now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found.' So the party began. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants, 'What's going on?' 'Your brother is back,' he was told, 'and your father has killed a fattened calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return.' The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, 'All these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me. And in all that time, you never gave me even a young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf.' His father said to him, 'Look, dear son, you have always stayed with me, by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found.'" So we began by focusing last week on the surroundings of this text. So the end of chapter 14 and the beginning of chapter 15, to work together to look at what the text has to say about what Jesus was teaching about in this moment. Bringing Jesus' vision of a table where everyone is welcome into greater focus. What Jesus models here, if you've still got the text open in front of you, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 15, what Jesus is modeling here at the table where everyone is welcome is that he's pointing to something else, something new that God was doing in him, through him, pointing to something much bigger, a new way of being, a new outlook, a new kind of family. And this is one of the things we, I suppose, reflected on last week. Hospitality had always been integral to the story of God's people, where there was welcome to the stranger, provision for the needy, right at the heart of the community. But this was something that God's people, at this point in time, God's people Israel, represented in the story by the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, it's something that they'd obviously really forgotten all about. And instead of just, I suppose, recognizing that last week, referencing it again this morning, I actually want us to carry that idea with us into all of our reflections in this final parable of the trilogy. I want us to take it with us into grappling what Jesus is aiming to tell us about the sons in this story. One of the key themes, there's many, but one of the key themes that's bubbling beneath the surface here is that things are not as they should be with God's people. Things are not as they should be with God's people. Here he is. Here Jesus is, the one that they claim to know and love, and they don't recognize him. Here he is, right in their midst, calling them to join him in what he's doing, and they criticize him for it. If we track through to the very end of Luke's gospel, one of the things that we learn is that they're so unnerved by this feast that Jesus is calling everybody to, where there's room for everyone. They were so unnerved by that, they actually killed him for it. God's people are far from him. They have forgotten who they are. And they have forfeited the call that was on their lives to be the light and the life of God out in the world. And instead, one biblical commentator says, they opt instead for a different brand of fidelity. So instead of going out amongst the peoples of the world to be the light and life of God there, what they do is that they withdraw into themselves to protect themselves from being changed by the culture around them. But this idea of, I suppose, being far from God as a people, it's not a new idea for Israel, unfortunately. All we have to do is look back into the Old Testament and see the pattern of their lives. Two of the great stories from their past. Firstly, the Exodus, when Israel was brought out of Egypt by God to come home to the promised land, is one of them. But alongside of that sits this equally prominent story of the exile. Maybe it's a word that you've heard before. When Israel finds themselves, through a variety of different circumstances, losing their way and being forced to do what? They're forced to live out in a distant and foreign land apart from the place of the very center of their being. Does that sound familiar? Does that ring true? Ring any bells? This theme of exile is hardwired into chapters 14 and 15. The Oxford English Dictionary, it describes exile as, like it does on the screen, if you just take a minute to read it for yourself. An exile is a person who lives away from their native country, either out of choice or compulsion. To be an exile is to be separated from one's home. A separation that involves a sense of alienation and of not belonging where one is placed. And even though Israel was no longer, by the time of Jesus, in physical exile anymore, at the time of Jesus' life, they are spiritually speaking in a virtual exile. One of the ways I suppose I was reflecting on it this week, essentially The people of God at this point of Jesus' life, they were at home physically, but spiritually they weren't at home. They weren't themselves. And that's what makes the mention of salt here in chapter 14 so hard-hitting. If you can remember what we looked at last week, I want to read it for us again. Verse 34 and 35. Salt is good for seasoning. So Jesus is speaking about their purpose as a people. Salt is good for seasoning, but if it loses its flavor, how do you make it salty again? Flavorless salt is good neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Anyone who has ears to hear should listen and understand, Jesus said. So he's holding nothing back in his critique of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Essentially, Jesus is saying, I gave you purpose as a people. I love you. I've given you purpose, but it's become so faint in your lives, it's almost undetectable. Can you hear me? Are you listening? Jesus' words are designed to provoke questions about complicity in us. How have they allowed this to happen? How could God's people forget what God has done in their past? Why would they choose to live away from Him, their true home? Some really helpful questions, challenging. Why would we? Why would we choose to live away from God, our home? And as we learn to place ourselves inside of this story of the prodigal son, I think it becomes painfully clear that exile is not as far away from some of our spiritual experiences as we might have first thought. This is not just the story of one nation and people. It is the story of all people. One theologian describes it as this: the prodigal son is the story from which we never depart. Other theologians call Luke 15 the gospel within the gospels. This story is as relevant for us as it was for those people. And the rift of exile, is very much present in this parable of the lost sons. And I'm being really careful about the words that I'm using here. Sitting underneath the usual treatments of the surface of this story sits the reality that both sons are lost. And maybe that's quite different from the way that you've historically heard the text taught. One is good, one is bad. One stays at home and is responsible, does what he's meant to do. The other just goes out and wastes everything. The younger son, I think, gets easily scapegoated here because he's the one, I suppose, that initiates the process. He's the one that dares to go, has the audacity to go and say to the father, give me my inheritance now, which essentially in Jesus' time was essentially saying, I want you to die. That's essentially what he was saying at that point. I want you to be dead so I can have everything that's due to me now. And then he goes away and he just squanders it all. All the language there in the original text is fascinating. We can't gloss over how deeply destructive his actions are, or how hurtful and offensive and radically contradictory this portion of the parable would have been to the people who first heard it. They would have had no concept whatsoever of any child going to their parent before they died to say, give me everything now. They just literally had no concept of that. But we shouldn't allow that to distract us from the lostness of the older brother too. And maybe that's kind of like a really radical kind of idea or interpretation of the text. And I want to encourage you this week, go and look at the text. Go and look at how it describes the behavior of the older brother. And as with Israel, so it is with this family. Jesus is being very deliberate and intentional. Everything is not as it should be in the life of this family. We're still working our way through this kind of idea of exile in the text. One of the pieces, I suppose, in my own reflections, I wrote this. Implicit in the concept or the idea of return is one of leaving. For any of you who know us, our middle daughter, Abigail, wave your hand there like the Queen. She's just been in England. She arrived home. How many weeks have you been away? 10 weeks? So 10 weeks away. I'm fine. My allergies came up at the airport, but that's all it was. But in the joy of welcoming her home was also, it was connected to the pain of letting her go to a foreign country and to fend for herself, as it were. The immense joy of welcoming back what was lost for the father holds within it the sorrow of what had gone before. Finding has losing in the background. So let's turn to the text again, if you've still got it open in front of you for insight around this. If you look at verses 13 to 17, just for a moment, what we read about here is an exile or a distance from God characterized by the wasting of who the Son is and in what he has. His radical rejection of home brought him to a place of famine, of loneliness and starvation, a place that sought to assimilate him and to, I suppose, that he would start to begin to fill the hunger in himself with things that were not helpful. He is lost, having fled from home. I think a lot of the time we kind of cover that ground very quickly as the church. Okay, there are lost people, and then there are people at home who are good, and so on. But if you look at verses 25 to 32, we read about another type of exile, another brand of exile, characterized by ego, jealousy, bitterness, rivalry. Imagine that, you're arriving home and a family member has just come home and you're annoyed about it and you decide, you withdraw and you choose, no, I'm not going in there. I'm not going to celebrate that. His radical rejection of home brought him to a place of isolation. And if you look at the text again this week, you'll see that there are these telltale signs of duty. Even the language, one of the older brothers, he talks about slaving for the Father. Those are not free words. Those are not words filled with or fueled by the love of the Father. They lack the grace and the hospitality of the Father's house. So he is equally as lost, I would want to suggest, even though he has stayed at home. And both parts of this story are working to illustrate the same fundamental reality, which is this: exile is not just a historical event. It is a denial of the spiritual reality that I belong to God. And every part of my being, and that he is my true home. Those are, I think, countercultural words to say the least in 2021 Ireland and Dublin. The idea that God, the Father God, is our true home. And that we won't really know ourselves, our own purpose and meaning until we are at home with him. The author, Henri Nouwen, he's written a book about this text called The Return of the Prodigal Son. If some of you are kind of eager to do some deeper reading, I just couldn't recommend a book anymore. It's all based on his reflections, theological reflections, having gone on and taken leave to study Rembrandt's picture, which is also called The Return of the Prodigal Son. But he says this: I have fled the hands of blessing and run off to faraway places searching for love. This is the great tragedy of my life and of the lives of so many I meet. Somehow I have become deaf to the voice that calls me beloved, have left the only place I can hear that voice, and have gone off desperately hoping that I would find somewhere else what I could only ever find in God. When we lay it all out in such explicit terms, it simply really is unbelievable. Why do we do this? Why do we do this? Why do we leave God, our home, to be masters of our own fate, where we're the ones in control? Where does this propensity to self-identify come from? And the more I think about these questions, the more I noticed how soft and gentle the voice of our loving Father is. I nearly kind of half wrote a completely different sermon in my preparations for this week, as I tried to grapple and jostle with the fact that the Son allows him to go. The Father allows the Son to go. The Father says yes to selling the farm and gives them the money, even though he has every confidence he's going to go and waste it all. What does that tell us about God? He never forces himself on us. He doesn't bully us. He never demands our attention, but waits and watches for whether or not we're going to notice the opportunities for returning to him that he places in our paths as his kingdom breaks in around us. And one of the painful observations as we sit with this passage is that there are so many other competing voices in our lives, aren't there? So many other voices that seek to drown out the voice of the loving Father. If you've still got chapter 14 in front of you there, just look at verse 35 again. What is it that Jesus says? Anyone with ears should listen. It's almost as if from the very moment we have ears to hear, what takes over are the counterfeit voices that lead us off towards starvation and famine. Verse 17, I'm going to close with this, is so significant for our thinking. If you've got the text still open in front of you, chapter 15, verse 17. 2 words in particular. And the first is this. It's pronounced how to. We're sold that the Son, how to, that he comes to his senses. This is the word that Jesus uses here. And what this means is that in this moment of coming to his senses, he sees himself as he truly is. And the second word comes just after it. And he says to himself, the second Greek word that Jesus uses here is pronounced phemi, which means to declare to oneself, to affirm, or as one dictionary I found described it as, he makes a whispering announcement. And I just love that idea. He makes the younger son, as he comes to him, his senses, how to, he sees himself as he really is, and in that moment, he makes a whispering announcement. However faint at first, the son's return begins, his physical return to the Father, it begins with a change of heart. Phemi, it means I am not my own. I belong to the Father. Not to this foreign place, not to this other way of living and of seeing the world in it. Just make sure you get my good side. Do you want me to? We're good? Instagram Live, baby. Phemi, it means I am not my own. I belong to the Father. That's my identity. Not this foreign place, not this other way of being and of living. My life has meaning and purpose. I am known and loved by the Father. I thought I'd get a whoop after that, but the thing that's really at issue here in Luke 15 and the prodigal son story is the question of to whom do we belong? Is it to God, or is it to the world and to all the different competing voices and cultures around us? The world says that we're only worth loving if we are good looking or important enough, if we're intelligent and wealthy, if we have the right kind of education, job, opportunities and connections, if we have powerful lives and productive lives. Whereas the generous and loving Father says we are known and we are loved, not because of what we do or achieve, but because of who we are, who he's made us to be. And that there has never been a moment, and we explored this as a community 2 weeks ago, as we were reflecting on Psalm 139 together. There's never been a moment since your conception where you were not known to the Father and he did not see you. He has made us for himself, and we'll explore this next week. We are free to join with him in what he's doing, the work that he's been preparing since the beginning of time, to make all things new. What a great idea or insight into our life's purpose, to work with God for the great return of all things and all people and all creation. The good news is that while things aren't as they should be, and that's what the passage is showing us, that's not the end of the story. And we're going to look at the return of the prodigal son in a bit more detail next week, particularly looking at what Jesus is aiming to tell us through the Father in the story. We're going to look at that next week. But what about us? What can we take away from this text this morning? Where do we belong? To whom do you belong? Are we at home with the Father? Or are there parts of our thinking and living that are distant or far from him, starved? Let's stand and pray together. Let's just allow ourselves a moment just to be still. It might be easier for you, although you don't have to do this, but it might be easier for you if you just close your eyes and just as we wait and ask God just to minister these ideas, these thoughts that we've been reflecting on together into our hearts and minds. Come, Holy Spirit, we're open to hearing from you. Maybe you find some of this language difficult to relate to. The Father. This idea of being at home with him. That God is our home and that we belong to him. Maybe that you just don't know what you think about that. You're unsure. You're kind of on the fence in terms of what you believe. But maybe you've just found yourself prompted this morning of just saying, okay, I think I'm ready. I want to come back to you, Lord. Or even for the first time in your life to say, I really want to give my life to you, God. If that's you, if that's the case, why don't you just, in the privacy of your own thoughts and emotions, just pray that prayer, even without saying it out loud even. Just go, God, I want to know you. Fill me with your Spirit.